video and your micro muted. Today we are here. We are really glad to be here for this, as I was mentioning before, for this first EUREGIO lecture. And before giving the floor to our chair, Professor Esther Happacher from the University of Innsbruck, I would like to thank some persons here. So first of all, let me thank Professor Fracasso and Professor Pertile from the School of International Studies, the director and the deputy director, because they had this idea of doing this lecture. Since we have, as Professor Happacher will say later, we have this EUREGIO project. So among the three universities, Trento, Bolzano, Bozen, and Innsbruck, with the idea of involving the students of the three universities and make it possible to have an exchange of research of ideas. We should be in Innsbruck today and tomorrow, and we are not because of the pandemic. So it is very beautiful to be here. So thank you very much, Andrea and Marco, for having this idea. Then clearly, I am really glad to have the possibility to thank Ambassador Zannier for being here with us and giving this lecture. And also the colleagues Esther Happacher from the University of Innsbruck and Mirko Tonin from the University of Bozen Bolzano, who are our partners. The last thing I would like to add before giving the floor to Esther is I would like to make use of this occasion also to welcome Professor somehow, because we know him since many years, but to welcome Professor Jens Wölke, because starting from March, so from some days before the pandemic started somehow, he is the EUREGIO chair, because exactly the three universities of the EUREGIO Tyrol, South Tyrol and Trentino decided recently to also to create this kind of professorships. And so the Professor Wölke, who works at the School of International Studies and at the law faculty of the University of Trento, will work also in the other two universities of the EUREGIO in the future. So thank you again. Welcome everybody here, all the participants. Now I give the floor to my colleague Esther Happacher from the University of Innsbruck. So Esther, you have the floor.
Thank you very much, Matteo. I would like to start by saying good afternoon to everybody, and by thanking everybody who made it possible to have this EUREGIO guest lecture, this first EUREGIO guest lecture, and I hope many others will follow. In fact, as Matteo Borzaga already mentioned, this is the result of a long-term cooperation between the universities of the EUREGIO, Innsbruck, Trento, Bolzano, Bozen. And we have for many years, for several years now, with support from the EUREGIO Mobility Fund, organized European research seminars, which have the focus of giving students and teaching staff alike the opportunity to discuss in topics of mutual interests, to establish networks, and to look a little bit further than their own arguments and topics. And that's why we do have a real interdisciplinary seminar. And I think that's the topic of today, which is inclusive policies as a means to prevent crises and conflicts, is an interdisciplinary topic, because it is not only a law topic, it is as well a political science topic. It touches on economic aspects, and as well as protecting national minorities is an interdisciplinary issue and not only an issue for lawyers, as I myself. As Matteo as well said, one of these seminars was supposed to take place today and tomorrow at the University of Innsbruck. We had to postpone it due to COVID-19. And then there came the idea to create this EUREGIO guest lecture with a well-known speaker on a subject that is of very, very great interest to all of us. And for this, I think we are all very grateful and we are very much looking forward to. So may I now hand over to Marco Pertile, who will kindly introduce our speaker. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Professor Happacher. Ladies and gentlemen, colleagues, students, it is my great honor and pleasure to introduce you today to Ambassador Lamberto Zannier, who is currently the High Commissioner on National Minorities of the Organization for Security and Cooperation in Europe. Ambassador Zannier, joined the Italian Ministry for Foreign Affairs in 1978 as a career diplomat, and served previously as Secretary General of the OSCE for 2 consecutive mandates, UN Special Representative for Kosovo, and head of the United Nations Interim Administration Mission in Kosovo. Other previous positions include Representative of Italy to the Executive Council of the Organization for the Prohibition of Chemical Weapons, the OPCW, Chairperson of the negotiations on the adaptations of the Treaty on Conventional Armed Forces in Europe, Head of Disarmament, Arms Control and Cooperative Security at NATO, the North Atlantic Treaty Organization. I'm sure that our students will understand, even from a cursory survey of this CV, how many points of connection there are between Ambassador Zannier background and the work we do at the school in our courses. With the director of the school and the coordinators of the masters, we advanced this project, I would say, rather this secret ambition of making it possible for our students to benefit from this outstanding expertise, not only in the context of a guest lecture such as the one we have today, but also in a more structured and comprehensive manner. We thus decided to invite Ambassador Zannier to teach a course in our masters, or at least given his many commitments, a part of a course. Well, today I am truly delighted to announce that the High Commissioner has accepted our request and that he will teach a course with myself at the School of International Studies of the University of Trento. The course, which is titled Conflict, Human Rights and Natural Resources, will be held during the 2nd semester of the next year and will be offered to the students of our masters. The aim is to investigate the causes of conflicts, both natural and man-made, and the role of the law and international institutions in settling such conflicts. Also, in this respect, having as a professor the former Secretary General and the current High Commissioner of the largest regional organization in the field of cooperation and security is a great honor for the school and a wonderful opportunity for our students. We are thus most grateful to Ambassador Zannier. Ambassador Zannier, thank you very much for taking the time to share this knowledge with our students and for accepting to teach a course with us. Indeed, our faculty strongly believes that ensuring cohesion in pluri-ethnic societies is one of the fundamental challenges of our time, and that the High Commissioner of the OSCE plays a key role in this respect. But this is also, of course, the topic of this lecture. So without further ado, I now give back the floor to the chairperson, Professor Happacher. Thank you very much.
You're muted.
Sorry, I forgot that I'm muted. So thank you very much, Marco. I think that we hand over now without much further ado to our distinguished guest. We are all very much looking forward to your lecture. Please, Mr. Ambassador.
Well, thank you very much and good afternoon, everybody. It's a pleasure for me to join you this afternoon and to contribute with a perspective from how can I say, someone who is operationally involved in these things, to your reflections on conflict, on prevention of conflict, on trying to promote stability in a world that is in many ways so unstable. My mandate is a conflict prevention mandate. It's not a minority protection mandate, as one might think looking at the title. Why conflict prevention? Because if you look around at conflicts, in fact, most conflicts are coming from within the societies. They come from within states. The traditional interstate conflict has almost completely disappeared. Of course, once you have crises, unrest, conflicts developing within states, then of course in this very polarized world, you immediately find the international actors who position themselves behind one group or another, coloring, of course, these internal conflicts and internationalizing them in many ways. And you can look around, you have so many examples. So the idea is looking at societies that are increasingly complex, increasingly diverse. What can we do to try to make them more resilient to conflict, better integrated, and better able to protect themselves from the risk of instability? This is at the core of what I do. So analyzing what are the trends, analyzing the weaknesses of diverse societies, and try to help them become more cohesive and stronger and more stable. The trends that we are observing, well, first of all, maybe I should start from the notion of minorities, because the definition of minorities is a bit of a problem. There are various kinds of minorities. Countries tend to monopolize or to affirm their right to decide themselves what and who is a minority and who is not. And this becomes a very selective process. There are countries, looking at them from the outside, you think they're relatively diverse in their societies, but they don't recognize to have minority because they're not foreseen in the constitution, because they have a concept of relations within the societies or concept of citizenship that are such that they don't allow for a space for recognizing in a way the difference of a part of the population and treating them with special arrangements as minorities would expect. So I tend to steer away from the notions of and the definitions of the individual countries, looking at the societies themselves. Societies that are becoming, in any case, more diverse because of also the impact of globalization, and people move around much more easily today than we've had the migration crisis. But even before the crisis, Europe and European countries, the societies were becoming much more diverse. And in some cases, this diversity was not, how can I say, well understood, and there was not enough effort of integration. And one of the consequences of that has been the impact of radicalization of certain groups within our societies that created violent extremism or even terrorism. And when people started wondering where is this coming from, they started realizing that not enough had been done to integrate those diverse groups in the society. But what had happened is that there were bubbles of groups, of minorities, in fact, they were not integrated, that were in a way transferring ways of life within those bubbles from outside. And this lack of integration created marginalization, created poverty, but also created this radicalization. So these are some of the problems that we see around and we feel we need to address. More generally, with societies having become more diverse, what we have seen is that there has been implications at the political level. Some political leaders have, in a way, manipulated or used the fears of people or the concerns of people at this increasing diversity to promote stronger, more nationalistic policies or identity politics, as we call them, which are policies that go in the direction of dividing even more the societies, of in a way encouraging the majority to align themselves behind a certain narrative, and a narrative that tends to exclude everybody else. And this has created fault lines within our societies. Externally, what we see also is that after the end of the Cold War, and basically the difficulties, I would say, in developing a new post-Cold War stable order, what we have seen emerging is a different kind of competition that replaced the East-West competition of the Cold War. It's a multipolar competition now, but that has created a dynamic of confrontation on a geopolitical basis. And this has also in many ways affected minority groups. Countries look at what they consider being their citizens living in other countries, and they reach out to them, they support them, and they support their needs, etc., from outside, and complicate very often the process of integration of these communities in the countries where they reside. And this is another factor that complicates these processes of integration. So how do we address all of these things? I have, as you see, problems of definition. So in a way, I always run the risk that countries tell me you are operating outside your mandate by addressing these groups. I always run the risk that being seen as taking sides whenever I speak in favor of one or the other group. You're with the government, or you're with the minority groups, and you're criticizing the government, etc. So what we found useful over time is to look at experiences of processes of integration and start developing recommendations based on best practices that we observe, taking into account also failures and problems that we observe, working with centers of research institutes in many parts of Europe to gain as many perspectives as possible and include them in our reflections. And over time, the office was established 25 years ago, well, almost 30 years ago, at the beginning of the 90s. Over this time, a series of recommendations there's 9 now, and we just developed a new set of recommendations on the COVID crisis, and I'll tell you something about this later. These recommendations have become useful tools because they allow me to engage in whichever situation in a technical manner, saying what needs to be done here is A, B, C, D to achieve this, and then on that basis I can criticize either the government. Sometimes I do criticize minorities too, because integration is a balanced and a two-way process. To us, a society is stable when all the communities are fully able to participate in every aspect of the political life of the country where they live. If the communities withdraw too much within their bubble, then this integration is not full, and they cannot really contribute entirely to the development in every aspect, political, social, economic, of the country where they reside. And the tools and the policies are manifold. The starting point for us is education. We find this kind of a first stepping stone for any policy of effective integration. And the key also in education, as in every aspect of policies that deal with diversity in the society, the key is always balance. When it comes to the education, you need to make sure that you take into account diversity in education, but you also promote as much as possible uniformity. For instance, when it comes to language, and you have diverse groups that speak different languages, I think it's important that everybody gets an excellent level of knowledge of the state language, because that is the key tool that will allow the person who belongs to a national minority or to a minority in general to find its place and to use all its potential to contribute to the life of the country where he lives. Because otherwise he will risk remaining marginalized and remaining stuck in the place where they speak his own mother tongue. I've observed this in places like, for instance, in the Russian Federation. I was traveling last year to Kazan, to Tatarstan, where there is an issue with the language there. The Russian Federation is an interesting place from the point of view of education. They teach in, I think, 24 languages. There are 24 languages of instruction. So there's a huge investment in education in many of the languages of the various republics of the Federation. But of course, the Russian language is taught everywhere. Now in Tatarstan, there were some Russians who complained, ethnic Russians, who complained that their kids were forced to study in Tatar language, and they really didn't feel that there was a need for them to do that, being ethnic Russians. So there was a reform of the law, and so this became. Then there was a possibility for people to opt out. So those who wanted to study in Tatar language could do it. Those who wanted to study Russian language had the option of having following the full curriculum in Russian language. The ones who were studying in Tatar language were also studying Russian. The Tatars say this is the beginning of a slippery slope, and we will. There is an erosion of the role of the Tatar language, and we will lose it in the end. But then, speaking to especially to some of the younger people, they were saying, you know, if we don't speak Russian well, we will be stuck here. We feel that we need to have a good knowledge of Russian to be able to compete with everybody else for important positions in the society, in the economy, and wherever. So I think this was a very good example of the kind of balance we want to achieve. So it's important to preserve through the education the identity of all minorities, but at the same time, it's important to give them the tools to better integrate in the society of the country where they reside. Next year, we'll mark the 20th anniversary of our recommendations that deal with education, and we will look at the challenges and the difficulties, but also the positive achievements in education in these 20 years. I started from this on education because I find it so central in what I'm doing. But of course, there are a number of other areas that deserve attention. The use of language and the balance in use of language. We sometimes see minority groups that have difficulties when it comes to engagement with organs of the state where they reside, because their language is not used enough, for instance, by the public administration or in the public sector in the areas where they reside. So the investment in ensuring, and we have seen this in the COVID crisis, there have been some studies from networks of minority groups that have found that only 20% of the assistance, the immediate assistance centers to which you can turn if you realize you might have a problem with the disease. Only 20% of these centers were trained to use minority languages. So in some cases, minority populations really had an handicap and had difficulties in getting assistance in relation to the pandemic because they didn't have the linguistic tools necessary, first of all, to understand the precautions, but also to request assistance and to be given the services in languages they understood. So this can become also a very practical problem, the language barrier. But of course, on the longer term, the investment in teaching the state language to the younger generation should make it easier in a way, and should make less dramatic the question of the knowledge of the language. In the rule of law area, both police and justice, the need to have this balance and to have an inclusive policy is key to making, how can I say, the perception, to creating a perception that the rule of law is in fact effective, that the law is equal for everybody, that there is no discrimination when it comes to justice or when it comes to the operation of the police. So what we recommend is that, first of all, the composition of the police and the judiciary should reflect the composition of the society. So once again, the members of the minorities should be given every opportunity to fully participate and to become parts of the judicial systems and of the police. Also because the police, for instance, will be much more effective in its own operation if it includes representatives of the minorities when it operates in areas where these minorities are present. If there is a perception that the police is an arm of the majority controlling everybody else, then the police will not be very effective in its action. They will struggle to have a good understanding of what is happening, to have early warning of potential problems, and to have a good dialogue with the people on the ground. And in the justice sector, it's exactly the same thing. A loss of credibility of the justice sector would represent a key loss of credibility in fundamental state institutions, and then would undermine the solidity, the credibility of the institutions of the country. So it is important to embed policies that are open to integrating minorities in all of these areas. More broadly, and we have a set of recommendations on that, the issue of participation of minorities in every aspect of the life of the country. And we are now working to deepen a little bit the work that has been done and to develop the work that has been done on analyzing the socioeconomic involvement of minorities. And so the participation in the economic sector is fundamental. Often minorities remain confined in certain areas and in certain regions, and they don't fully participate in the economic life of the country if they are not well integrated. And this is a barrier that needs to be overcome, and you need to understand what are the drivers. And we have seen some of the problems of this now again with the COVID crisis, where people who belong to minority groups have been hit harder than others. We have seen minorities, for instance, that reside close to borders, and very often minorities that are they have a strong territorial connotation tend to be close to borders, because that's how minorities they arise from changes in borders often. it's always historical processes that determine minorities. And with the closure of borders following the crisis, they suffered economic losses, in some cases more than others. And because in many countries, minorities are, how can I say, not necessarily the most prosperous part of the population, then this said, maybe this is not the case for Alto Adige, but in many other places it is. The closure of borders has created really serious economic problems for minority communities. So this is another area where we need to explore a bit better what can be done to create more incentives and to better include minority in the economic life of countries. The whole media area, media and minorities, is so important. One tool to ensure that minorities feel comfortable in their space is also that of giving them and paying attention to their needs in terms of, first of all, reflecting them and having a possibility to have their own media and to talk about their issues publicly, but also to have media that reach out to them and that share information of interest to the minority groups, also in their own language. So also there, it's a matter of balance. It's a matter of making sure the minorities, again, don't self-isolate themselves within the space. But having said that, it's important also not to force them to forget in a way their identity and to forgo that space that is so important for them to maintain their culture and their identity live. Because diversity is a richness and it has to be nurtured as such. It should never be cancelled, but it should be, if well integrated, it should be used to promote and to enhance the stability and the balance within societies that, as I was saying, are becoming, in any case, increasingly diverse. We have a couple of sets of recommendations that deal with the integration processes as such, and also that deal with interstate relations. Actually, those are called the Bolzano-Bolzan recommendations on interstate relations in regard of the problems of minorities. And the bottom line there is that, of course, the so-called king state has certainly a right to assist what he perceives as its own minorities abroad in many ways, in the education area, in the social area, cultural field, etc. But the limit to that is that this kind of assistance should not interfere with the processes of integration of the minority in the country where they reside. And ideally, they should always happen in a way that is agreed between the countries. So we always encourage the creation of joint commissions between countries to address and to discuss the problems of minorities, to discuss the policies that have an impact on the minorities. So the handling of minorities in a way that is somehow coordinated and transparent is always, in our view, the best way to proceed. One area we started exploring, we found fascinating, is that of historical narratives, because with especially now the increasing divisions and the increasing divisions on, as I was saying earlier, in terms of geopolitical divides. Together with that come also different interpretations, different justifications for these divisions, and these justifications go almost always back to interpretations of history, and we are doing this because this is what happened to us in the past, and here you have both both factors that I was mentioning earlier. On the one hand, the identity politics. So the fact that countries and leaders tend to, in a way, base their own power on and their own political force on promoting visions that are popular with the majority. And so it's easier to use a narrative that goes in the direction of this is who we are, this is what we have endured together, and this is what we achieved together and all this, as opposed to say, well, we have come to this point, we have evolved, we have become this, we need to discuss where we're going next and what are the next steps, which is much more difficult to do. Recognizing that there is a change and that things have evolved for that. But certainly the former narrative is a narrative that does create divisions within the society because it's not inclusive, and so this creates weaknesses. But then it also creates fault lines internationally. Look at the debates around the Second World War. We have seen, for instance, the president of the Russian Federation has come up with a number of statements that some people have found, to say the least, not justified or not agreeable, on assigning blame for the beginning of the war, and but also the overall narrative on the Great Patriotic War, which is certainly a war that did affect massively the Soviet Union and the peoples of the Soviet Union, but that others see in a different way. And I've seen this in countries where there are, how can I say, ethnic groups living side by side who share very different interpretations of the past. For instance, the Baltic states. You go to Latvia, where 25% of the population are ethnic Russians, and you see victory monuments, and these are monuments to the Soviet soldier that liberated Latvia from the Nazi occupation. And I went to see one of these monuments near Riga, a huge thing, and I saw flowers there that were brought by people who were honoring the memory of their fathers who fought and who helped free this country. So they were saying the basis of our freedom today is there. And then at the same time in the parliament in Latvia, there were groups that were saying we need to tear down this monument. It's offensive. That was the beginning of the Soviet occupation of the country. And in fact, during the war, there were Latvian troops that fought on the side of the Germans against the Soviets. So in fact, history can be extremely controversial. So you have to pay attention also how to handle these monuments, how to handle these narratives within a single country, because this might really become a serious problem in the society, and then it can be exploited. Now I have, for instance, the Russians, they're complaining about reforms in the system of education in Latvia that, according to them, is penalizing the Russian language. So still today, I received a letter from the Speaker of the Parliament in Latvia, and we are discussing these reforms with them. It's important that also there a degree of balance be retained, and the needs of the minority be taken into account. You can't simply ignore these differences, but you need to build bridges, and that takes time, takes patience, but it also requires attention to how to overcome these different perspectives. One of the things we're thinking about is introducing a degree of multi-perspectivity in the study of history, because of course historians say there is something that is called the mirror of pain and pride. What is a pain or what is a pride for some, and you build a monument to a general and you celebrate a great victory, can be a drama and a black spot in the history of another. And people may want to forget about that because it was a disaster for them. So it is important to take this into account as societies become more diverse, because if you don't do that, then you really risk creating instabilities within your society, stabilities that then will translate into instabilities at a broader level between states. So there we are now wondering whether we can come up with some principles, and it's very interesting work that we have started doing with a number of historians. But there is, of course, a legal aspect that is very important because there are international conventions that need to be taken into account. We're working with UNESCO. We're working with a number of external actors on this. In the work that I do, and I don't want to continue too much, also to give some space for a discussion. The method. So as you see, I'm not a legal tool. I work very closely with the Council of Europe. The Council of Europe has conventions there's a framework convention on the protection of national minorities, and that is in a way the golden standard in Europe. And we look at what they do. There is a committee that deals and they do visits and they assess the treatment of minorities in the light of the convention, really in terms of the protection of minorities. So we work with them and we take into account what is done. But my work is more political, and it's often based on quiet diplomacy. So I travel, I speak to representative minorities, I discuss with governments, I try to propose reforms of legislation in a way that reflects the principles that we promote. I sometimes struggle because I work well with administrations, and then the draft laws go to parliaments, and in parliaments I find this environment I was explaining, and then laws get turned upside down. So what goes into the parliaments is a relatively good draft law, and what comes out of the parliament is a problem that we need then to handle in terms of how it is implemented, because otherwise it creates all sorts of problems within the society. We had some of these problems with legislation in Ukraine in the last couple of years, and we are now dealing exactly with the implementation of these laws that is highly contested by neighboring countries because they feel that their minorities are penalized in Ukraine. So there are many examples of areas where, let's say, attention is required, but where it's better to, how can I say, not to use a megaphone policy, but to engage quietly with the various actors, try to address the situation in a way that is, and to encourage everybody to address the situation in a way that is constructive, and avoiding that this turns into another potential cause of conflict within the society and potentially also outside. In the case of Ukraine, well, there are different interpretations of what is going on there. Obviously, the Russian Federation is very actively supporting some of these separatist fighters in eastern Ukraine, apart from the Crimea issue, which is obvious. But there is undoubtedly a problem also within Ukraine there, when in Kiev, after the Maidan how can I say, events, then somebody started saying, well, we need, first of all, to ban the use of the Russian language in a country where a part of the population were Russian speakers. And they really felt anger towards the revolutionary guys in Kiev who wanted to promote all sorts of policies that they disagreed with. So there was also an internal Ukrainian problem that the neighbors managed to, how can I say, exploit or build on or encourage in some ways. So this to show how these policies can be easily related to conflict, and we find it everywhere. Actually, there are a number of what we call frozen or protracted conflicts in Europe, and they are all related to unfinished work on issues related to minorities, and whether it's Transnistria or South Ossetia or Abkhazia, it's a problem of lack of integration, and with all sorts of additional complications, political connections, but also linguistic and ethnic aspects do play a significant role in these conflicts and need to be addressed, also in the context of the attempts to resolve them. Let me make one final point. As I say, we have issued a number of recommendations on the COVID crisis, because we saw that as governments acted, and they had to move very fast to address the emergency, the urgency of this situation. They've taken a number of shortcuts, also in terms of democratic practices, and we've seen full powers given here and there. We have seen robust police operation here and there. And what we saw is, in general, that these measures tended to penalize some groups within the society, or did not recognize that some groups within the society were affected by the crisis more seriously than others. And so we try to draw attention to governments to this, and we issued a series of recommendations relating to access to services, access to media, the language issue that I was saying, the problems with education, because taking shortcuts in the education system, what tends to be forgotten is the mother tongue education in many places, the reopening of the borders. More generally, I would say that it is worrying to see that this crisis, that is a global crisis. We are in a phase where we face, as humanity, we face a number of challenges of a global nature, beginning from the demographic trends, which is turning into a crisis in itself, the climate change, the migration trends, so the mass movements of population, now the pandemics. All of these global crises, and you could have a much longer list of these problems, of course. They require global strategies and shared policies. No single country can solve them by itself. You really need to create coalitions and to analyze and address the problems together through shared strategies. And what we are seeing is exactly the opposite. We see attempts to geopoliticize the crisis, even with accusations from one country to the other. You exported, and we're seeing it with minorities, representatives of minorities, or even in countries like the United States. At some point, the Chinese community had problems. But we have seen in various places in Europe, minority representatives, they were somehow accused of contributing to spread the disease. The Roma settlements and the Roma have had serious problems. They're being contained forcibly within their settlements in some places, in some countries, without any real assistance, simply intervention of a security nature. And that is with clear violations of human rights. So even there, we had to intervene, and there is a strong attention by the international community in general to situations of this kind. So to have recommendations and to draw the attention of the government to the need to look into this situation, to keep them in mind, I think is important in this phase. But more generally, what is worrying is that at a time when you really need these shared global strategies, governments tend to withdraw, tend to close the borders, tend to withdraw behind walls, and we see multilateralism or the investment in multilateralism really lacking. I see it in the OSCE, but it's in front of everybody also what we see within the European Union, the debates in Brussels. It's a bit disheartening, I have to say. Within the OSCE, it is the same, and we have countries who say there isn't much. We should continue, business as usual in a different way, because meetings now are online, also in the OSCE. But there isn't enough, how can I say, appetite or even vision to say how can we use these frameworks that we have established as frameworks for cooperation to address problems that affect us all in the same way. And because when we talk about minorities, it's not only an issue, and of course I'm looking at my angle, but the discussion can be much broader than that. The issue is not so much about this or this other minority, but it's about having a policy that applies and having certain recognized principles that apply universally in the space covered by the organization. Then everybody, of course, you always have principles, and then you need to have tailored policies to adjust them to the specific situations. But I'm not seeing that. And it's really, there is a renationalization of the responses, and the level of international cooperation is very low. So I think this is the time to speak up, as I'm doing myself, and to say we need really to return. This is not a zero-sum game. It's not something where if I win, you lose. It's something where we all win together or we all lose together. And this is also true for the European Union, where there are these debates on the assistance. And if countries start having serious problems, this will affect the whole construction. And then the investment has been made over the years may suffer significantly from the lack of unity in addressing these global problems. I stop here, and then I'm happy to have a discussion with you on any of these issues. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ambassador, for this extremely interesting presentation. I would like to give now the floor to your questions, remarks. Please feel free to use the chat as well as just put them to the ambassador or to the audience by removing your mute microphone. I see. I propose that I will just collect 3 questions. Okay.